about, currently immigration restrictions make it hard for Mexicans to come to the United States if they don't have advanced degrees and skills. But we need to see Mexican immigration to the U.S. And I sort of hedge about immigration because you might want to take the IM off if you think about migration, meaning these, the Mexican-U.S. borderlands connection raises some questions about about the separation of those two countries. They're really integrated after 1848, and increasingly more so. But in any case, Mexican descent workers are among those who help build an industrial U.S., and the U.S. West is a very important part of that. Another thing that's traditionally erased from many histories is the fact that it's a very multicultural West with people of African descent, Asian descent, people coming up from Latin America. And again, a lot of the immigration history that's taught in schools tends to focus on European immigration. Not that that's not important, but there's this crucial phenomenon in the U.S. West, and Mexican workers are often recruited for key economic sectors. So they're not just working in agriculture, they're building railroads, other important infrastructure, and importantly, in the late 1800s, starting in, I believe it's 1882, we see restrictive immigration legislation with Chinese exclusion acts. So when the door is shut to Asian immigrants, and then in the early 20th century to certain groups of European immigrants, Mexicans and other Latin Americans, but again, I'm going to focus a little more on Mexicans, are able to come into the U.S. Not that they're not also stopped at the border. In 1924, at the same time that there's an Immigration Act that establishes restrictions on other immigrants, including Asian and European, this is the year that the Border Patrol is instituted. And in the early part of the 20th century, maybe 60,000 Mexicans were coming in annually, some of them working seasonally. In the years 1928 to 1929, that was reduced by 75% because of interceptions at the border. I wanted to point out one of the pictures that I have here is a picnic organized by LULAC, which was one of the many sort of self-help organizations that people of Mexican descent developed. Initially, LULAC emphasized citizenship and was opposed to especially undocumented Mexican immigration, and has been painted by some critics as more conservative, but they were a very important civil rights organization in terms of litigation regarding school segregation, and they're around to this day and have changed their stance on immigration, in part because of some of the persecutions that occurred mid-century. So just as Mexican labor was recruited in the 1920s, we might think of a revolving door operating for Mexican immigrant workers, similarly to what we can see in other historical cases. The guest workers are desired, they come in, and then when there's an economic downturn, they become scapegoats. And this is something that was dramatically illustrated during the Great Depression with pressure in local communities, states, and eventually federal efforts to repatriate Mexicans. And there was some cooperation with the Mexican government because it's a complicated story, but during the Depression, Mexicans were often the first to be unemployed, denied relief. If they might have been eligible for relief, the idea was, oh, Mexicans get by on less, their diet is different. So many Mexicans were facing economic hardship, and the Mexican government at the time did cooperate in trying to repatriate some. But it must be said that another part of U.S. policy was to create basically a climate of terror through raids and incarcerations. And so we could see this as an early example of trying to promote self-deportation by creating a very, very unfriendly environment for the Mexican descent population. And another thing that's important about this period of repatriation, and the numbers are really hard to pin down. You'll see a variety of estimates, but a good percentage of the people who were repatriated forcibly or somewhat voluntarily were U.S. born. There were sweeps that, scooped up anybody who seemed a likely suspect. And I think the historical resonance of this period is something that is shaping a lot of activism today about draconian immigration laws, including in Arizona. We don't have time to get into the discussions of race that were so eloquently raised earlier, but the issue is that for people of Mexican descent in the United States, even if race is a social construct, they experienced racial discrimination. And you can see some of this language of, we need to get these folks out because of their undesirable social and racial qualities. And that is, an important historical antecedent for what we see today as well. As a good illustration of that revolving door, bring the workers back in during the Second World War because we need labor to replace U.S. workers who've gone to the war front or elsewhere. There were also opportunities for Mexican Americans who may have been second or third generation or even longer time residents to move into new sectors of the economy, as you see by these women railway workers during the Second World War, Rositas, if you will. And the U.S. and Mexican governments negotiated a guest worker program called the Bracero program, which, as you notice, was extended long after the Second World War because of the pressure of employers. So here we have this illustration of the somewhat recognized demand for labor. It should be added that some of the opponents of the Bracero program included Mexican American unionists because this program, which increasingly offered fewer and fewer protections for the guest workers, jeopardized the ability of unions and others to gain better wages and conditions for longer resident workers. Then here's the part that I really have to contain myself because this is one of my research specialties, but I am excited by the idea of activists at many, many different points in history challenging these structures of inequality. And in the 1930s and 40s, there was considerable labor and civil rights activism among Latino populations, a lot of Mexican descent participants in the organizations that I looked at. We could certainly see this as part of a more global phenomenon with the rise of the left and unions, many of them challenging white supremacy in this time period. And there was certainly plenty of white supremacy to challenge, as you can see by some of these signs from California restaurants here. But central players in this activism included labor unions, left-wing groups, including the U.S. Communist Party, and they had allies with the Mexican Communist Party. But they weren't the only or the majority activists in these struggles. But the fact that you had some leftists involved in them did mean that organizations working on labor and civil rights in this period were targeted for repression. And I think this is a really important point. A longer story, but these activists could have made a real difference in the future of U.S. and Mexico, and thank you. And they were the ones who were shut down. There's a variety of mechanisms, legislation used to contain the influence of these activists. So many of the sort of un-American activities acts that were passed during the McCarthy period, alluded to earlier, anthropologists suffered, academics, and many of the people who were involved in this labor and civil rights organizing. There were immigrant rights groups like Committees for the Protection of the Foreign-Born who tried to assist individual activists who were targeted, and they themselves became the targets of investigation and persecution. The important thing that I want to end on is that the activism continues, so it's taken a variety of forms, but so do nativist currents and immigration debates. And this is really trying to set us up for our next presenter, who will do more of the contemporary immigration activism. But obviously there's a resurgence of Mexican-American activism in the 1960s. Some of the veterans of the earlier movements are part of that. We see also some important challenges to new immigration laws and the enforcement of existing immigration laws. One immigration act that's important to mention is the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, because in addition to setting caps rather than quotas for immigration from certain areas, it also included an updating of the language about refugees. But again, to be a refugee under these terms, you had to be fleeing a communist-dominated country or a natural disaster, which shut the door to refugees from repressive, anti-communist regimes that the United States was supporting. We saw in the 1980s activists basically violating immigration law to support refugees from these countries, and I find it really interesting that the name of this earlier sanctuary movement, helping Central American refugees in that time period, now we're starting to see the new sanctuary movement recognizing a new wave of persecution of immigrants from Latin America. And we may in questions get to return to Proposition 187 in California, which aimed at denying public services to undocumented immigrants. But as this graphic from one of their brochures illustrates, there's a highly political agenda in trying to disempower and discourage these immigrants from coming in as well. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Ute Judge. She's in the history department also, and she's been at SUNY Scotland since. She's active in the Latin American Studies and Latino and Latin American Studies Committee, and her research interest is in international human rights,
Indigenous rights, immigrant rights,
immigrant rights, as well as she is a very strong advocate in Amnesty International, as well as the New York Immigration Coalition. Please welcome Dr. Ute.
Thank you. I'm going to take a look at what's going on in the country. I'm going to give you a lay of the land of what's going on, and then also talk briefly about activist responses. So just looking at the Obama administration, in 2009, Obama promised to work on comprehensive immigration reform. And as he was articulating that, he said, well, okay, we need a pathway to legal status, but we cannot have people coming here and breaking the law. So undocumented immigrants should pay a penalty, pay taxes, learn English, and go to the back of the line, which is a really stupid statement because there really is no back of the line. But he also stressed plans on strengthening border security and also addressing issues of labor exploitation. And really, where we've made most of the headway is the border security part, right? And that was intended to bring the Republicans along and to make it more palpable for them to support comprehensive immigration reform. In terms of legislation, that's been a big failure. Congress has failed to pass comprehensive immigration reform. Congress has failed to pass the DREAM Act. So basically, it left the president only one option, kind of at the tail end of his term, to enact DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which affects a very small percentage of people. But in the very least, it may force the Congress an issue so that Congress actually has to decide what to do now with these people. At the same time, in recent years, we have anti-immigrant laws, most famously Arizona SB 1070, but also in other states. Some of these are being challenged. They're being challenged by the State Department, by various courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and also by organizations such as the ACLU, which has repeatedly asserted racial profiling when it comes to enforcement. In 2010 alone, over 1,000 anti-immigrant ordinances have been passed around the country. So what I'm really hoping people will come away with here is that the climate in this country is extremely polarized. you do have advocates for immigration reform, but then you also really have people on the extreme right engaging in tremendous hate rhetoric and also disseminating a lot of misinformation, right, about what really the basic facts are. So again, Border Patrol, that's actually where the president has fulfilled his promise. As of last year, we've built 650 miles on the southern border with Mexico, and the cost of that border fence in the San Diego sector alone is $21 million per mile. Okay. The estimated cost, these estimates keep being adjusted upward. The estimated cost to finish, and this is just the border with Mexico, right? We're not even talking about Canada, which is a border significantly longer, incidentally. But just on the Mexican border, projected cost $22 billion, but that's just to build it, right? To actually operate and maintain it. We're not even talking about staffing it, right? We're looking at another $6.5 billion over the next 20 years. Again, securing the border was supposed to answer to Republican critiques. They said, we're not going to come to the table to negotiate until this border problem is solved, until we're, protecting us from these hordes of brown people coming across, basically. The bottom line is a lot of emphasis has been put on the border and building the wall, and we actually have drones flying down there as well. It has not brought Republicans on the table. So that was really, from my perspective, a wasted effort at compromise, right? But in terms of human cost, this is what's been happening. Because the border fence is in many of the urban areas, people have been pushed further and further into the desert. And even though the total numbers of people crossing has slowed, which is in part related to the economic downturn since 2008, deaths on the border are sharply up. So we're now looking at an estimated 300 to 800 per year, meaning on average, 1 to 3 people every day die trying to cross the border. And just in Arizona alone, and just last year alone, 177 human remains were found, and some of these skeletons are in various states of decay. Sometimes we can't even determine whether or not we're looking at a male or female skeleton. Right? So the human cost has been tremendous, and represents the deaths on the border represents a 30-fold increase in the last 11 years. So under the Obama administration, we've deported more people than during any other presidency. Right? We're deporting people at the rate of 400,000 a year. Every single day, about 34,000 people are in immigrant detention. So under the Obama administration, we have deported 1 million people. Okay, these people have families. Okay, and 1 out of 5 of these people who are deported have U.S. citizen children. Right, so many of these children are either de facto deported with their parents. Right, if they're minors, the parents, as parents, have the right to make the decision to take the children with them. Or they're left behind to be taken care of by family members, friends, or they end up in foster care. Right? So for the foster care system, this has been a tremendous strain and difficulty. So in essence, every year, if you're deporting 400,000 people a year, this is going to affect over 1 million people a year. Millions of people have been affected by these deportation policies. Right? And again, the Republicans are constantly screaming, Obama's not done enough, we're still being overrun by hordes of brown people.